Good day everyone, my name is Glainne Vertudazo from ED 31B. I'm going to discuss the literal and figurative language. So basically, language is generally divided into two categories, which are literal language and figurative language. Literal language is rely on the real definition of words and phrases or their literal meanings, while figurative language relies on implied meanings which can be understood differently depending on the location or who is using it. For example, when we say the sky is blue, relies on the literal definition of the word blue, which means color, while when we say I am feeling blue, relies on the figurative definition, which means I am not feeling okay. Let me give you some trivia. According to research, color blue is associated to tears, hence, or sadness. Because all figures of speech rely on the use of figurative language for their meaning. Let me define you the word sarcasm. Sarcasm is mocking or bitter language that we use to express different meaning than what we say. Often the exact opposite when your intended meaning is the opposite of the literal meaning, and that is called irony. Another type of figure of speech, which includes common phrase like "oh great" when you really mean something is bad. For instance, the picture shows that the one person says that don't work too hard to the person who is literally doing nothing, and that is a very good example of sarcasm. Slang. Slang is language that uses atypical words and phrases to express specific meanings. It varies greatly by region, demographic, and language. For example, you would find different slang in the US and in the UK, even though they are both English-speaking countries. Likewise, teenagers and the elderly will use different slang terms, as with Spanish and English. Many slang terms are figure of speech. For example, bro could be used to describe a friend rather than an actual brother. This would be using the word as a figure of speech. Another examples, whatcha, which means what are you thinking? Wanna, want to. For example, I wanna race cars. Ama, I am going to. Outa, out of. Kinda, kind of. Have to. Gimme, give me. Gotta go. And that is example of slang. Let us now talk about the literal language. Say your friend's dog escaped from its teether. If you were to tell him that his pet is off the chain, what do you think his response would be? Most likely, he would thank you for the compliment rather than searching for his dog. Or he probably wouldn't know you were implying literal language, which refers to the use of words solely by their defined or primary meanings as opposed to any other meanings we give them. Literal language by definition does not use figure of speech. Instead, literal language uses the actual meanings of words or phrases in the exact sense. Literal language is also a very straightforward and to the point. Literal language is precise and often tells the reader exactly the point, and the reader or listener does not have to extract meaning. Here's now the figurative language. Let us now go back to my example a while ago. In the case of your friend's fugitive pet, the literal usage of off the chain probably wasn't the best choice of words. That's because this phrase is typically employed as figurative language, which identifies the use of words in figure of speech to convey meanings different from their usual definitions. Figurative language can include things like metaphors and similes. In other words, we tend to use off the chain in ways that we have nothing to do with the literal meanings of off or detached from, or chain, that is later typically constructed of interconnecting mental links. Instead, combining these words into a single phrase yields an expression that identifies something as excellent, extraordinary, or just really cool. It's important then to remember in what the context we're using or encountering words. For instance, having a dog escape is not the best time to bet on your friend's literal interpretation of off the chain, since you probably won't take these words in their primary, non-figurative senses. So, as a rule of thumb, we should always avoid figurative language when there's a chance that we're not getting across exactly what we mean. In contrast, figurative language uses figures of speech to make the content more persuasive or to have a greater impact. Figurative language also uses figures of speech such as metaphors, similes, or an oxymoron to make the message more meaningful. A writer uses figurative language to create more interesting and often colorful content. Types of figurative language. Figurative language can take form in 5 specific ways. First, understatement or emphasis means highlight or diminish an idea. Second, relationships focus on how things are interrelated. Figures of sound focuses how the words actually sound. Errors highlighting a mistake. And last, verbal games, which is plays on words. What's the difference between literal and figurative language? The main difference between literal and figurative language is complexity. Literal language is not complex, while figurative language tends to be more complex and is not always very straightforward. Literal language is precise and expresses exactly what the author or speaker means, while figurative language may take interpretation on the part of the reader. Literal language does not use confusing words, or does it encourage the reader to think beyond what is being said. Figurative language often uses symbolism, requiring the reader or listener to think beyond the words that are written. Literal language expresses the main point, while figurative language is type of language uses literary devices instead of relying on the actual meaning of words or phrases. What do you think is the importance of literal and figurative language? Literal language is often used within the field of science and research. You might consider using literal language when writing a term paper on the effectiveness of alternative energy solutions, or if you were writing a paper in chemistry class. The use of precise, straightforward language would be the best option. Literary language should be used when the goal is to give an explicit explanation. Authors use literal language when they want to get their point across in the direct manner. The importance of figurative language. Figurative language does have a place, however, figurative language is often used in poetry or narrative fiction. If you were writing a paper that compares and contrasts medieval female characters, you may want to include some figurative language. Figurative language can also be very helpful in a persuasive papers too. Authors will use figurative language when the goal is to persuade the reader or evoke the emotion. Additional information regarding difference between literal and figurative language. Again, literal language means exactly what it says, while figurative language uses similes, metaphors, hyperbole, and personification to describe something, often through comparison with something different. Let us now look to the examples below. In a literal descriptions, we say, grass looks green, while in a figurative description, we tend to say, the grass looks like silky green hair, which uses simile. Sand feels rough. Sand is soiled water. Metaphor. The flower smells sweet. The flower has the sweetest smelling petals in the world. Hyperbole. Grasshoppers make a high-pitched noise. Grasshoppers are fiddlers who play their legs. Personification. And that is all for literal and figurative language. Thank you and God bless.